Hello, everybody. Danny Toff here, back with a topic of introducing a book. It's the book, Is the Commission Still Great? So we got this somewhat provocative question here on the front with the globe. And then the subtitle is um, Eight Myths About Missions and What They Mean for the Church, right? So Steve Richardson, the author here, is addressing some challenges that are often presented when it comes to arguing for global mission. So I'm going to use a presentation here. So again, the title of the book Is the Commission Still Great? It's a book review that I'm giving you here, or a book overview for a book written by Steve Richardson. And so a word about the author. So the author, Steve Richardson, he's a practitioner, right? So he writes as the president of Pioneers, and a little bit of background. Steve Richardson grew up as an MK, meaning as a missionary kid in Indonesia, the son of Don and Carol Richardson. So Don and Carol Richardson were missionaries in Indonesia decades ago, and Don wrote Peace Child about their experience there of being missionaries, which has become a missionary classic. And so actually, Don and Carol Richardson, when they went out with RBMU, the agency which in the 1990s became World Team, which is actually the agency that I'm working with. So there's a bit of a personal connection here. But anyway, back to Steve. So Steve and his wife, Arlene, also spent 11 years planting churches among an unreached people group in Southeast Asia. So they followed a similar in similar footsteps as his parents, did a similar kind of work before they moved back to the US. And the Richardsons now live in Orlando, Florida, and have been blessed with 4 daughters and 10 grandchildren. So that's a little bit about the author. And the big picture of the book, what is it about? Well, as Richardson explains in the introduction of his book, which was published in 2022, as you can see here. So he has a short introduction, and there he explains the purpose of this book is to help dispel some of the fog surrounding the nature of our mission in today's world, especially for believers in the West, right? So the reason he uses the word fog here is because he starts his introduction with a metaphor from World War II, and where the British started to use radar, and he explains a little bit more about that. It's fascinating. You can read it. At the same time, they were also saying, our pilots need to eat a lot of carrots because that's good for their eyes, and that's how they can identify the planes of the enemy. But really, what was helping them was the technology of radar, right? Of having that objective picture of what was happening in the skies. And so he uses that as a metaphor that we need God's perspective on things, right? Recognizing that, especially in the West, missions nowadays is somewhat under attack, or there's a lot of questions or doubts that come up when it comes to missions. And so what he wants to do in his book here is address some of those challenges and questions and doubts. And so he has a number of chapters, and in each chapter he has a perception, right? A challenge. And the first one is as identified here under perception 1, missions is peripheral, right? So that's one of the challenges that people bring up and saying, well, it's really not that important. And the way that Richardson came across this material that he's presenting is, of course, based on his own experience and many years in ministry and his own insights, but he also conducted a survey among 120 pastors, missionaries, and church members. So not a huge number of people, but people that he knows and that he was able to contact, a group of people who are missions-minded. And then he asked them, what is hindering North American churches to engage in missions right now. And so, of course, he got a lot of responses. And one of them is that one of the insights he got from his survey is that 82% of the respondents included missions is important, but not primary in their top three choices. So that's what he has on page 16. So I'm just giving the page number here in parentheses. And so his response is he has a theological or biblical response, right, where he says, well, of course, we have the Great Commission passages, right, in Matthew 28 and Mark 16 and Luke 24 and John 20 and in Acts chapter 1, verse 8. But there's also a grand narrative in the Bible stretching from Genesis to Revelation that talks about how God desires to display his glory among all nations. Which, for that, there are key passages in Genesis, in the Psalms, and also all the way to Revelation. So he makes the solid biblical argument that indeed missions is not peripheral, quite the contrary. And then here we have also a quote that illustrates what Richardson wants to communicate, which is a proper understanding of global missions will remind us of the immense privilege we have in aligning ourselves with God's will. All right, with that, we are in perception 2 or chapter 2, which is the challenge. Western missionaries are obsolete, right? And here, of course, Richardson, he's very well aware of what's happening all over the world and that the church is rising in the global south, or what sometimes is called the majority world, right? Where we refer to Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And he says the encouraging growth of the church in the global south is unquestionably reshaping the missions landscape. Our role as Westerners and contributions are shifting. And he will come back to that idea in the end of his book, making some suggestions how Western missionaries can still play an important role in the world. Then he has this challenge for us here. Jesus didn't tell us to make enough disciples so that they can finish reaching the rest of the world without us. None of us is finished until the job is done or the Lord calls us home. Perception 3. Everything we do is missions. I've heard that quite a bit. Maybe you have as well, right? It's kind of like saying, hey, everything we're doing is missions or is missional, and everybody is a missionary wherever they are. So his response to that is, when missions is everything and everyone is a missionary, we struggle to find words to identify the people who invest their lives in long-term efforts to cross linguistic and cultural boundaries in order to make disciples in people groups that do not yet have a gospel witness. The church needs such people, and we have to call them something. If we confuse or generalize our vocabulary, we forfeit our ability to speak with precision. So I find this last phrase there very interesting, when he says we need to speak with precision. Right before, he says we need to find words, and then and I think that does say something about where we are today, right? Also in the middle, when he says we have to call them something, right? When we're talking about these people who have this apostolic calling, this apostolic task of doing pioneer work in a different culture, in a different language. Historically, we've called them missionaries. Maybe that's not the best word, but we have to call them something. And I think this idea that language is changing, or how people perceive certain words, or that different groups of people might use the same word and might mean different things by it. I think that is a challenge we are increasingly observing in the past few years in our society, and it is also affecting the way we talk about missions. Chapter 4, perception 4, is missions competes, or the title of chapter 4 is missions competes against everything else. And then the perception right after the title is formulated as this: perception 4, pursuing missions comes at a cost to other important ministries. A global focus reduces our local impact. So here the chapter starts on page 73, and I'm just giving you this to give you an idea how his chapters are structured, right? So So the way his chapters are structured is it gives us the number of the chapter, then comes a short title that already gives us the challenge that Richardson will be talking about. That is then explained with the full sentence under perception number so and so, as in this case, perception number 4. Pursuing missions comes at a cost to other important ministries. A global focus reduces our global impact. And then actually before that, he has a quote, right? And by other well-known people, and in this case, it's Alan Flees, who said, regardless of the particular work God has for each of us to do, the one aim of us all in doing our particular job for the Lord must be the evangelization of the whole world. So here already we see that this quote is already part of his answer, or part of how Richardson is addressing this topic, right? So he recognizing that, yeah, sure, if you have a global focus, then you will be able to do less on the local level, but it's not a zero-sum game, and we have to remember what the big picture is and what the goal of it all is, right, in the big scheme of things. And so, of course, then throughout the chapter, he will explain in more detail, why he disagrees with this challenge, or why he thinks that it's still worthwhile to invest in global endeavors. And then at the end of each chapter, Richardson has discussion questions. And in this case, he's got 3, and they are: number 1, what tensions do you personally feel as it relates to global missions? Number 2, how might a global mindset benefit your family, local ministry, and congregation? And number 3, how could an abundance mentality change the way you and your church make ministry decisions? So some very interesting questions there, which again, I think is one of the strengths of this book, that it invites conversation, and it is a book that you could use in a small group setting, or some kind of team setting where you're reading it together and then you're discussing the questions at the end of the book. Part of that is it has less than 200 pages of text, and so it's very readable. And with that, we are going with perception number 5. Missions is now short term. And then he includes a quote from a missionary. So throughout the text, he mostly, Richardson, of course, has his own thoughts. And then on some of the pages, he has a quote that's like set apart and in bold letters, that is either from a missionary or church member or a church leader that he interviewed for the survey, or that he got responses from for the survey. And so here we have an input from a missionary, which I think is very useful to evaluate the role of short-term missions in global missions. So this missionary says, it is difficult to correctly identify needs and develop appropriate actions without the long-term relationships associated with career missions. Short-term missions is often about being seen to do something and focuses on the one going to the ones being served, right? So especially this last part here, a lot of people agree on that, right? That short-term missions often primarily benefits the participants. It doesn't benefit the missionaries on the field so much, because they can easily get distracted from the ministry, right, while they are welcoming and leading the team that has arrived. It also usually doesn't do that much for the local population, because short-termers may not know much about the culture, they may not know the language, and there's only so much you can do, right, when you're somewhere for 1 or 2 or 3 weeks. So there's this challenge. Of course, at the same time, the fact that it does benefit the short-term participants is also one reason to do short-term missions, right? It can also benefit them in a way that it not only blesses them for the time that they are there, but it also gives them possibly a vision for long-term missions. And that's something that missionary agencies and sending churches and missionaries who are already on the field, they will rejoice in that, right? Because they are looking for more workers to join the global harvest fields. And so I'm not going through all the chapters, just giving you a taste of the book, but the remaining chapters are in chapter 6. We have the challenge or the misconception that missionaries are wholly rare and strange, right? And because they are wholly rare and strange, a lot of people feel intimidated and feel like, well, missions is not for me. Chapter 7 is the accusation that missions is harmful. Chapter 8 is the perception that missions is failing. And in chapter 9, then Richardson points to a way forward, and it is here where he makes some specific suggestions, right? What roles, especially Western missionaries, can still play, and so he describes some roles as encourager, catalyst, connector, resourcer, and pioneer. And he also summarizes some of the argument that he has given in the book, as he also does in the conclusion of his book, and where he then again points to Revelation, specifically Revelation chapter 5, right, where John has a vision of Jesus the Lamb, where it says that Jesus is worthy to take the scroll and open the scroll, because he was slain to purchase persons from every tribe and language and people and nations. The emphasis of their praise is not just that Christ has redeemed a lot of people, but that those people represent the full spectrum of humanity. So that is the big picture, and we as the church, we as the followers of Christ, as believers, we have the honor of participating in this great endeavor. And so of course, his answer to this question in the title of the book, is the commission still great, is definitely the commission is still great. And so I encourage you to consider buying this book, or reading it in a group together with some other people that maybe have questions or might already be interested in missions. In any case, I want to thank you for your interest in this topic, and I want to leave you with this question: what role are you playing in the Great Commission? Thank you so much, and I talk to you next time. Bye.